can do that, because you can't do that everywhere, you know, especially in the South. Then places that are not pressured, think about them, but it's got to be an area that has the potential to kill what you want to kill. So,
number one, Michael, one thing you mentioned is the idea of getting behind the pressure where you're having those deer getting pushed to you from other access points. How do you go about scouting that? How do you go about looking at a map in order to find those kind of areas? Because not every piece of public land has 2 to 3 miles between the roads. So how do you analyze where pressure should be coming from and make a decision where a big buck should be pushed to if there's a lot of hunting pressure?
Okay, on a basic mandatory map, most of them will show where all your food plots is at and a lot of your access. And 75 to 85% of the hunters are going to use them access roads that's around food plots generally. So look at them. You can look at topo maps and aerials and see some of that. And a lot of things I'll give up the first, say, opening day of bow season or opening day of gun season. You can drive around after daylight and see where the majority of the people are going to park. You know, because everybody's fired up for the opening day. Find out where they're parking at. And if it's dirt roads, you can actually see where deer have crossed to get away, to go back, to get away from them people. So, but anything outside of that and the rougher part, most people, because, you know, where we hunt at, there's very little, you know, thinned and clear cut stuff, so it's a rough blow downs. You know, find them places where most people ain't gonna go to. Them deer are gonna migrate to that. Bucks and some of the does will travel because they browse more than a lot of people think. They don't worry about food plots as much most of the time. Browse, acorns, they'll hit them just like somebody's opening a candy store. They're waiting on that because that's candy for them. It's not really living food. Browse is what they're, you know, living off of. So they'll browse way, you know, a mile or so at night to go to a food plot to look at it or check it. So I always try to stay a mile or so or more from the food plot and people that I think are coming in. But you're right about the smaller man there is just you hang toward the thickest stuff. You know, a lot of people are going to use the easy stuff. You hang toward the thicker stuff and the out of the way places.
Now, how long did it take you to learn that hunting pressure is something that you can use to work for you instead of against you? And maybe talk about hunting back in, like, especially the 80s and 90s. In Alabama, again, Michael Perry's from Alabama, there's a ton of gun hunting pressure. We have a very long rifle season. So talk about how you kind of learned to use hunting pressure to your advantage, and then how that kind of built out where you're going to kind of focus some of your time and efforts, you know, targeting mature bucks.
Back in the 80s and stuff, you know, versus now, sometimes you'd have 1,000 people or more lined up at the checking station. So you always had to figure out something to use them people is what we did. Like I say, we always kept up either driving around after daylight or just knowing. It takes years, you know, we're still learning, you know, stuff because it changes at times. Sometimes you'll have something happen and changing or we'll have somebody truck falling and, you know, trying to keep up with it, you have to change to adjust to them people. But it's a never-ending process. I've been some of them areas I've been hunting for 10 years and still learning, but I'm still expanding. So just keep adjusting, keep up. You know, sometimes if you're hunting, it's hard to keep up where other people are at. So if you're getting in there hour before daylight, so some people aren't doing that, but just pay attention where you see people at. I document everything as far as I see stands or other cameras. You know, keep it on the phone, write it in the books.
When you're talking about trying to find a back way into an area that's going to have a lot of pressure, so say you have a lot of pressure coming from the north, and you know there's a lot of pressure coming from a road that's to the north of you. If there's a road going around the south, or maybe there's not a road going around the south, how do you dictate where you want to put your truck at in order to walk in there, knowing that you're going to have all that pressure pushed towards you? What are you analyzing in order to find that area to get around these guys and either walk a lot longer than these guys are going to be willing to walk to circle into a spot, or put yourself in a position where you're using all that pressure to get pushed to you?
Most of the time I'm putting it where I can use some kind of creek drainage or something to get in between them, you know, basically above creek crossing. But the drainages are usually easier to get a long distance and travel through, you know. So sometimes wrong ridges with old logging road that you got, there's going to be a lot of blowdown stuff that makes it harder. But most times you can hit a drainage and just take off and get between them. Use your, you know, maps to do that.
Anyone that might know about Michael knows he likes to run trail cameras. Michael, talk to us about the annual patterns and how you use that data with trail cameras to figure out where you're going to hunt for next year. And how long have you been doing that and having success doing that specific tactic?
All right, before I started using trail cameras, you know, you'd always use these hunches, and then I always like hitting drainages, you know, creeks, and finding big tracks, some kind of wet, you know, especially after rains, and always think, why is that track there? You know, I always stop and look at that track, look around and say, why is that track exactly right there? Then now, since I've got cameras to kind of verify, find out, I put cameras in these places, but I won't put a camera there unless I know I can get there and somewhere I would hunt. I don't really care about inventory, just free range. I want the camera to be like where I can climb a tree, where I know I can access it without missing the deer, without crossing trails. If I can walk water, water's the best way to access to be less scent intrusive. But sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes I'll walk water and pop over a ridge or a side ridge to pop over. But I'm always using that camera for next year's info by, say, putting it out in February, come in August, check the batteries, pull a card, leave it all the way to February, see what bucks is cruising, when they're cruising, keep them dates documented, keep up with how big they are. If they don't show up, pull that camera and go to another one, keep finding fresh places, because generally, especially on public land, them time frames really mean something. So it's just, you know, it's pretty much year after year within a few days when them bigger boys, because you just don't, I don't get them walking around like it's, you know, like they're going to Walmart, whatever. Them some guns, as soon as the rut's over with, they're getting their body weight built back up, lay up, move around at night, and it's dark pictures when you get them, very few daytime pictures until they get up for the rut or something. So it's just everything I'm doing for the next season, least intrusive, cameras twice a year if I'm going to check them, and then other than that, just basically ready to hunt them. So.
Now, you're not just putting trail cameras in random spots. You're very strategic on where you put trail cameras. Before, we talked about trail camera placement and for high odd spots and not just putting in random spots in the woods. I would like for you to talk about what is the terrain and habitat like along the public land that you like to hunt, to give listeners and the viewers here and the attendees an idea of the kind of habitat that you deal with in the terrain, which then dictates how you're able to put trail cameras out in these very specific locations.
Everybody that listens to my podcast knows creek crossing is one of my main things. Everywhere I hunt's got something to do with some kind of water, creeks, you know, drainages, swamps. So figuring out where they're crossing at, but tying in other things to where they're crossing at, where it's a point, long point, bluff gaps, blowdowns, keeping up where the does would be bedding, because in wintertime, them does love them long points that got sage grass or some kind of blowdown stuff where the sun gets to them on the southeastern places where the sun gets up and shines on them, and them bucks will know where them places are at. But finding a creek crossing tied into some other kind of funnel or pinch point when they're going to check these points looking for does is one of the, you know, key things. But I'm always, if I hunt specifically on a creek crossing, it's generally going to be where I can't, that wind is not going to swirl, and it's always going to be on the south side of the main doe trail, because a buck's always going to generally cross below or the downstream side, because they can pick up scent from any kind of draft. So they're using that draft or thermal to their advantage. So I'm always on the downstream side, and if it's somewhere where the wind could swirl, I'm up somewhere above that, close to either a big blowdown tied in with a point or a shelf or a bluff gap or funnel, something that gives them closer to where I could shoot a bow or maybe a gun.
Now, Michael, in a lot of places you hunt, it's a lot more kind of hill country compared to Jonathan Moreland, who we just had on, who hunts extremely flat topography, very, very flat areas, just like the floor that we're all standing on now. A lot of places that you hunt have a lot more elevation change, maybe not crazy, but much more than what Jonathan was doing. So the creek crossings you're talking about are a little bit more in hill country. With that specifically, how is this topography playing out? Actually, before we even answer that or talk about that, explain what is a bluff gap, because some people here may not even know what the term bluff gap is.
Okay, so a bluff is just going to be a flat wall, inaccessible. Deer can't get up it. You know, say it runs a quarter mile, half mile, whatever. One little gap where they can get up. That gap can be a foot wide, 10 foot, 20 foot, and some of them I've seen where deer and pigs jump 6 foot to a ledge and jump another 6 or 12 foot to get on up. It's just the smallest thing where they can access, just basically like a median in the highway where they can get across to go somewhere up to a safe point or a bedding area.
Now, with the bluff gaps, the creek crossings, how important in your area when it comes to trail camera locations do you like to put your trail cameras in and around where you have bluff gaps in addition to a creek crossing?
Well, that's just like anything. The more things in one area, it's just like thermal hubs or what we call crow foots or wagon wheels. The more things that point to something, and then you add that to some kind of pinch that helps that, say a gap or, you know.
So give us some examples when you're looking to put trail cameras out and you're soaking them for a full year. Again, we just had Jonathan Moreland on, and he was talking about, especially on feed trees, he checks cameras, you know, every 6 to 7 days if he can. You're not doing that. You're letting these cameras soak for the absolute whole season. Talk to us about what are some of these locations that you really like in your topography, your area of Alabama. Where do you typically like to put a trail camera for your highest odds of success of catching a mature buck using that area?
For my morning hunts, you know, I'm gonna 90% of the time I'm gonna be higher up because most of the places I'm hunting for mature bucks is so rough, so tight that the swirling wind is hard to get away with. So I want to be above. So evening hunts, you know, I'm gonna get tighter. Most of the time I can shoot my camera for the bow. So it's gonna be, you know, you got people put them high, low. It's just that's specific on how you want to set it, but most of the time I have the better luck with them about a foot off the ground. So
now with annual patterns, I want to talk about this 196-inch buck you've got over here, state record muzzler buck you killed in Alabama on public land. How did annual patterns pay off for targeting that specific deer?
I have 2 cameras in this area, 2 different creek crossings, and he would use both of them in say a quarter-mile area. But there was only one time of the year that I got any daylight pictures of him at all, and it was the first week of November for 3 years in a row. And the first time I waited until November without messing with him, the first day that I was off on the last day of a muzzleloader hunt, November 5th, and caught him, you know. So.
Now, typically, how are you using the annual patterns to hunt a spot the following year?
Another point is he walked by that camera without getting his picture took that day. So.
Now, again, kind of going back, when you look at a lot of mature bucks that you've targeted, it's not always you're killing the same buck you've had on camera. And I'd love for you to discuss a little bit about this. It's more about just how mature bucks are using that area and where to target them based off the time of the year they're going to be moving the most.
I want to be somewhere where I got multiple, you know, playing odds, just like gambling. I don't want a creek crossing or any kind of funnel during that rut frame. But then every bit mature buck within 3 miles is going to come through there checking for those. I've only killed one big buck that I had on camera. That most of the time there's 3 or 4 big ones, and they'll come from 3. I had one I killed with a bow I didn't have on camera, but another guy had him on camera. But I had 4 other bucks that was just as big or bigger using that same crossing checking for those. So I want to be to play the odds. I'm not buck specific when I'm hunting. I'm buck specific. Groups of big bucks that come through looking for those. A big enough area that's got multiple things that point to certain, you know, like drawing X's. You got multiple food sources, multiple bedding. All they're going to cross somewhere and try to find that spot where a crossing or a pinch or edge that'll force them by.
Now, I want to open up the floor real quick while we're talking about annual patterns and seeing what questions some people may have, because this is a very interesting topic. Now, I've always been fascinated with Michael and his success finding areas based off annual patterns with a trail camera. Does anyone here have any specific questions on annual patterns and how to focus on that in order to have success in areas?
You were saying that you'll hunt these areas when bucks are chasing does. Well, what about earlier in the season? What are you focusing on at that time?
Early season, I like finding satellite bucks outside of the area. You know, I'm looking for big tracks. I'll do some early season scouting before season, looking for individual trees, just like Jonathan. You know, and mainly that's evening hunting because it's so hard to catch them in the mornings. So I'm specifically trying to find a buck coming off of some kind of point, something steep, where he's been crossing the creek and growing to some white oaks, red oaks. So generally and if I do a morning hunt, it's going to be like on the same level where they've been accessing oaks going back to bedding. And them hunts I'm only going to do like 1 or 2 days max, and I'm moving on to something. And we only have, say, 3 weeks to use that pattern, and it starts flipping the light switch as far as pre-rut and stuff, so you can kind of change it. But mainly the evenings is when I'm doing that, and I'm not I'm not staying in places much because it's so easy for them to figure you out. So in the morning, it's so hard to try to get in there without them knowing you're there, because generally they're back to bed, so I don't play with them in the morning that much unless I think I can get out of there without getting busted. But on them rut hunts, I'll hunt them crossing every gun day there are. So if they have a 4-day gun hunt, I'll set it. You know, I don't worry about the wind going across because generally I can have them shot, but I don't want it to blow toward where they're coming from or where they're going. So.
Michael, to kind of go off that question, you killed a real big buck with your bow a couple years ago, really wide buck during bow season. How did that hunt play out, and then how did you know, or why did you go into that specific area? And I believe it was a creek crossing. Why did you focus on that specific area early in the season to kill that deer?
It's a historical place where I've had a camera. I think that year was, anyway, I think in that tree of that area, last year I passed one up that would have been 5 years in a row I could have killed one or something. So, but it's a tight like hub that I'm hunting on the down like say wind side where they're crossing the creek by a bluff and going up toward a pine thicket. And he was just chasing the doe, and just luckily I got him to stop, or he just stopped on his own basically. But I had 4 other bucks that was 120 and up crossing the same areas.
Does anyone else have any other questions specifically on the annual patterns and kind of how Michael Perry uses that specifically for targeting areas for mature bucks?
As far as the annual patterns go, are you looking for the same weather conditions also, or just if the deer was in this spot a year ago, that's where I want to be?
It's mainly about the dates to me. So on the cameras, I keep up the dates that them bucks are crossing in the daylight normally, and just keeping up them dates. I'm documenting every deer I see year to year and just keeping up with the dates. And just, it's always, because generally the rut to me, now I'm not a scientist or anything, it's going to be the same time frame. You know, weather and moon might play with it where it's at night more than versus the day, but it's generally the same timing. So some people, I think Jeremy Aaron I've talked about a certain day he want to be somewhere an exact day. I won't be there that day, but to me, like, and where I hunt at, December 2nd would be the day. That's the day I've seen the most chasing, the most grunting, or the most cruising than there is. So I'm focusing around that day. So.
Also something, Michael, I want you to discuss on, specifically, this is something interesting with Alabama. There's some other states similar to this, but Alabama, a lot of our public land, especially management areas, there's very specific time frames you can hunt with firearms. We have a very long firearm season, but a lot of these management areas have 2 to 3 days a week or every 10 to 15 days that you can actually hunt with a firearm. And you hunt with a bow, you hunt with a muzzler, and you hunt with a firearm. How do you take that in consideration when it comes to hunting pressure, but also how you focus on some of these funnels when you have the right funnel and the right conditions that you have annual history with, that you go and target those areas?
When it comes to them dates, I don't care what's going on. You know, I'm hunting with a gun, muzzleloader, or bow. I'll hunt bow hunt, but in between them gun hunts. But in them dates, you got people that say are going out west certain dates for the rut. Well, I kind of schedule some of my vacation on some of them dates, and I'm hunting regardless. I don't care what kind of gun hunt it is, because generally now they've extended some of them gun hunts to 4 days. So I don't really worry about that pressure unless if I stay 4 days in a place, I'm going to move to. I've got enough places or swap mandatory size that I'm changing. But I'm going to give them 4 days. Don't care about who's hunting or what hunting, because the deer don't really care about it when it comes to rut. They're going to do what they got to do if the doe's in eat, so they're still going to be visible.
Also, on these short hunts, these short window time frames, how important is access going to these spots if you're hunting these locations 2, 3, 4 days in a row? You talked about water being a huge part, but when you're considering a location that you're going to be going into that you have annual history with, how do you go about figuring out the best access route so that when you have the chance to hunt, you can get in there cleanly and get a good opportunity at a whitetail?
Yeah, generally these places I always have a tree kind of picked out, and say in the spring I can go ahead and rake leaves back where I can get to that spot, say the last 50 yards without stepping on anything. But I don't want to cross a deer trail if there's any way I can get around it. So if I have to, I try to get or know where it's at and step over. But I'm not going to cross one. I ain't going to come through a bedding area. I'm not going to come through a food source. I want to be able to either wade a creek and go straight up to where I'm going to watch a thermal hub up that way, or come over the top from the other side where I can watch down on it. So.
Now, if anyone here like myself is interested in focusing on targeting areas with annual patterns, how would you recommend someone get started when running trail cameras, finding these areas that they can, start focusing on maybe their own public land, whether it's in Alabama or in another state, from the people that are attending today? How would they go about starting this season to focus on an annual pattern and using the data off their trail cameras for next year?
Well, you go hit the drainages, walk looking for big tracks or looking for old rubs. The best rubs I like finding either the rubs are going in a straight line. Generally, sometimes they're like he's going to a food source or he's going to a bedding area. But the best ones are, to me, is when you get to a thermal hub or a crow's foot or a wagon wheel. In these pinched areas, there'll be rubs that are rubbed on different sides of trees going different directions. Them places are so historical and mean a lot. Put a camera there, a couple cameras in different places in that, and just start putting cameras out in anywhere where you see a track or big rubs that's got some kind of do with a funnel or a creek crossing, some kind of edge. I don't like putting any kind of open wood, some kind of edge, some kind of elevation change to an edge or to a cutover or different pines from hardwood, any kind of transitions, any kind of, fresh droppings, big droppings, just start putting them out. And you got to start somewhere, and keep up with them, document it, and do as a big a circle as you can doing it.
Now, do you have a trail cam strategy for finding bachelor groups right now in the summertime, right before they shed velvet, and then trying to relocate any of those deer when they actually break up?
To me, a mature buck, especially in the south or where we hunt at, if he's hanging around with another buck, it'd be like one another buck, maybe two, but most of the time he's not hanging with a bunch. So them big bachelor groups of 3-year-olds and under, I don't really, don't pay attention. I don't set up any kind of cameras for specific to them. But I always keep in mind when you're looking at area, the more things you got, because bucks generally like some kind of elevation or hump or something to bed on, to see. So when they bust up, they're going to spread out to different places like that. So when you're looking at a topo or something, the more of them places you got that leads to where you're hunting, and when they go to looking for does or keep it on them does, you got better odds at more than one buck. So they always, when they bust up, they're going to get on their own areas, but they're going to come up and keep track of them does.
So not only, Michael, have you killed a few world-class deer, you have more trail cam photos of absolutely monster deer than anybody I've ever met. Now, most of us will never see those here. He only shares those photos with a very select few people, if any people, but some absolute giant whitetails in Alabama. Have you noticed, is there anything specific about public land in areas that for whatever reason those mature bucks can get the age on them in order to get that big? Have you noticed anything about ruggedness or any kind of area that truly for whatever reason it always holds mature bucks and something that's potentially repeatable? He's smiling because he knows there's something there.
Well, you got to ask these questions. You got to keep some kind of secrets, man. The more rugged, the more mountain goat stuff they are, the bigger bucks like it, and that's all I can say. That's how.
So it really comes down to the most rugged areas you can find. And, we've all been in spots like this. I've been on public land in a bunch of states.
It might be 50 yards from the truck. I always go by, the overlooked, stuff. I've seen where a buck bedded within 50 yards of a dang road and some boulder stuff that was piled up. So, but gun hunting, you can't do it. So.
Now, is that something that's consistent, as in those bucks, I'm talking really big, like the top 1% of those bucks, always seem to be in that kind of habitat for the most part?
The monster ones I get on camera, it's got something to do with some of the stuff you wouldn't think a buck would be going to.
And I'll say all this, Michael mentioned this earlier, y'all might not mention it, he's had to change vehicles a few times because photos, get shared and people know about stuff. So he has always changed vehicles because people follow him around on public land. So it's an interesting dynamic that Michael deals with. But with this, the consistency that you've had finding these deer is what to me blows me away. And I think there's a big takeaway for all of us. And it really comes down to finding extremely rugged habitat. If you're in flatland, it might just be swamps. You can talk about this too, because you've killed really big deer, not necessarily in mountainous terrain or hilly terrain, but really swampy stuff that people just don't want to go into. Kind of like Jonathan Moreland talked about earlier, killing deer using hip waders to get to the tree because the water's waist deep and they're killing deer in waist deep water. So, I'd talk a little bit about that, especially from maybe some of the more like swampy areas, and the idea that you might not have that really steep rugged terrain, but you still have cover and vegetation and water that keeps a lot of people out of areas, and that's what those big mature bucks really like to hold up.
Yeah, I kind of use the swamps similar to, say, the thermal hub stuff, but swamps in between different humps or different food plots, different cutovers, but I'm always looking out past, normal people just look at a small picture, you look out past, say, a mile or 2 mile thing and look at what everything else associated with that. But, most people are scared of snakes now, as far as swamps. Now you got alligators are coming on up, so deer get in there and they find, especially bucks, they'll find dry spots, little humps. They get in there and wait for, because those travel, when the pressure gets on this one place to hunt, those tend to run them skirting going to different points and different food plots. So them bucks have figured that out and they lay on them little humps waiting for them to come by and the wind catch them, they'll pick them up and follow them. But I love hunting the swamps. I'm not a big fan of going too far in because a lot of times you'll cross too much because them big bucks are always zigzagging a different way a lot of times. I've killed some from, say, 7 different directions in the same spot because it's just whatever they feel like doing that day.
And that's what I wanted to ask you next is, how do you see the mature bucks traveling in areas with more swampy conditions versus that hill country, more mountainous? And how does it differ, but also how is it similar?
Generally, when I'm hunting them, it's like I'm kind of chasing the rut, so it's generally more doe associated. So the most luck I've had is on the edge of a swamp that's close to doe bedding, and they're just, it's pinched down to 3 or 4 different points that's coming. Also, say a mile away, there's 2 or 3 other big, huge cutover tracks that's got a bunch of points and stuff that people like walking.
How important is it for you to know your doe groups and areas, especially if we're talking rut hunting here? How important is it to know where the does like to bed, how the does like to travel, and paying attention to that as well for the annual patterns?
Y'all remember a podcast about West Mo and little Annie Doe or whatever she was? So I had one on B-side on Black Warrior that 2 years in a row I killed a buck off. Well, I know it was her, same dang trail, same way. But now what happened to her? I didn't see her last year. But anyway, keeping it, I like I say, you let them does alone early. If you want to doe hunt, if you're buck hunting, I just don't like messing with them. I don't want them pressured, so let them run their normal life. Because that damn old doe is one of the hardest suckers to kill, especially bow hunting, because they learn to circle stuff before they go and just, they walk slow, point always, and they got 2 or 3 other does with them that's looking, so leave them alone, keep up with them, keep up where any kind of different food source, red oak, white oak, water oaks, your greenbrier patches, different bedding areas, they love a lot of sagey stuff sometimes if you got that, and just keep up with them and leave them alone. But they're more, sometimes, especially when acorn's on, those are being more nomadic. They move around, feed, and lay down, move around, feed, and lay down, so it might take a couple days to actually pinpoint where they're at.
So we've covered a lot so far, especially when we're talking about the habitat that these big mature bucks like to stay in, rugged, in hill country, the most rugged stuff you can find, hardest access, swamps, you gotta have water and super thick cover. I want to open up the floor again for some more Q&A. What questions do you guys have that you'd want to hear Michael talk about or discuss, or even a question maybe you thought about after hearing Michael on a podcast, something you want to hear him discuss in more detail about? You can raise your hand if you have a question.
You've not said the word scrape today. Just wanted to hear what you have to say about that in terms of cameras or patterns or historical data. How do you use scrapes?
Most time, I don't hurt anybody's feeling or anything. I don't really pay that much attention to them. I know they're there. I've put cameras on. I've tried a couple tests with different scents and stuff, trying to see if there's any kind of pattern. The only pattern I can kind of figure out is a lot of times whenever I do something like that, if I get a picture of a buck on a scrape, that sucker ain't back. I don't know if he's coming and checking it downwind, so I quit messing with them like that. But I know they're in the area, but I would rather do like what I say on them edges. I've just had more luck. I've tried hunting scrapes. I know people have luck with it. If I was going to hunt one, it would be the big community scrape. The more licking branches, the better, and tighter to some kind of cover. So, but I know they're there, but I just don't mess with them like a lot of people do. So.